So, Professor Newman, there are a lot of concerns about new variants, the UK variant, the South African variant, the Brazilian variant, and now I'm even hearing about a California variant. All places I would love to travel, but can't go these days. So given the risk associated with these new variants, is the government justified in limiting our rights in the name of safety, or do you think maybe the things that they are already requiring might be enough?
Well, I certainly agree with Professor Bracken that it depends on some of the epidemiological evidence. But one of the things that's very peculiar about what the government announced recently is that their restrictions on travel don't line up with those variants. So they persuaded the airlines not to have flights to destinations in the Caribbean, but there are still flights coming in from California, from Brazil, from the United Kingdom, from South Africa, I think. And so where's the alignment with the issues about these variants? Of course, if worse variants develop in the future, that could also play into things. But at this point in time, it's not obvious that the existence of those variants shifts the analysis when there are other ways that they have of limiting the health impacts on Canada.
Thank you. All right, so Professor Bracken, we know that the government has existing prohibitions. For example, there's already a requirement to test to board a plane, and now I guess a test when you leave the plane, and a requirement to quarantine at home. And if we're piling these restrictions on top of each other, aren't they becoming a bit redundant, and therefore maybe limiting our rights more than is necessary?
Yeah, look, I am the first to agree with government measures that are legitimately aimed at protecting the Canadian public and the Canadian public's health from what is a really quite substantial threat. I agree with Professor Newman that there are some kind of head-scratching discrepancies in what the government is doing. Why aren't they stopping flights from countries that seem to be the origins of the new variants? But I think at a kind of broad philosophical level, probably most of us as Canadians are willing to have our individual liberties restricted and are willing to have a pile-on of requirements if the result of those is that we really are able to push back this threat to all of us. But we want to make sure that those measures aren't discriminatory against, for example, LGBT people or people of color. Like there are all kinds of issues around them. And importantly, we want to make sure they work. We don't want to suffer restrictions on our individual liberties if there isn't some collective benefit for our society that they create. And that's where the evidence issue is so important. And I can't really answer your question because I'm not an epidemiologist. It really does come down to fact. It comes down to science. As constitutional lawyers, we know what questions have to be asked, but it's really medical and epidemiological experts that have to provide the evidence that these policies are based on. And the policies have to be based on that evidence, or they deserve to be challenged.
So let's just talk for a second about the cost. If the quarantine hotel was less than it is, $2,000 per travel, would that make it an easier infringement to justify? Or is the cost irrelevant here? And that's for either of you. Let's start with Dr. Newman.
I think the cost does come into the analysis because that is an extra barrier to Canadian citizens re-entering Canada. There are other countries that are running quarantines in hotels where the cost isn't $2,000 for 3 days in a hotel. So there are questions to be asked about why it is that the cost has to be so high. And we heard from the guest in the earlier segment that that's certainly an extra barrier. When somebody goes across the border, to visit a dying relative, or when someone is thinking of going across the border to get medical treatment or something else that's important. If they're facing a cost of $2,000 to return versus a cost of $200 to return, it's an added barrier and deserves constitutional scrutiny.